The last thing my husband Stuart said before leaving for work that Tuesday morning wasn't, "I love you." It wasn't even, "See you tonight." He paused at the kitchen door with his coat, half buttoned, and his work bag over one shoulder, looked back at me and said, "Elspeth, whatever happens, promise me you'll be fair to Florence." I laughed. Not unkindly. With the particular weariness of a woman who has spent 38 years navigating her husband's relationship with his younger sister. "Stuart," I said, "I'm always fair." He nodded slowly, as if he was filing my answer away somewhere for later. 2 hours later, his office called, "Cardiac arrest." By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone. Stuart Robert Alderton and I had met in 1986 at a teachers' conference in Guelph, Ontario. He was a civil engineer who read history books for pleasure, who made decisions with the deliberateness of a man who believed patience was a form of respect. I was 30, teaching at a primary school in Hamilton, newly moved from Cape Breton, and deeply grateful for someone who didn't feel the need to fill every silence. We were married 11 months later. We spent the next 3.5 decades building something ordinary and solid and entirely ours. We never had children. Not for lack of wanting, but life folded that way, and eventually we made our peace. We had our rituals. Friday dinners at the Italian place on King Street. Summers driving the Trans-Canada with no reservations. Saturday mornings reading the paper across from each other without speaking. We were not a dramatic couple. We did not fight loudly. We were the kind of people other people called boring, and I had always considered that a compliment. There was one constant shadow in all of it: Florence. Florence Alderton. Florence Marsh, after the marriage that hadn't lasted, was Stuart's younger sister by 7 years. She was the kind of woman who arrived without calling, borrowed things she forgot to return, and started sentences with, "I hate to ask, but," before asking for something considerable. I never disliked her exactly. What I felt was the steadier thing. The grinding exhaustion of watching the same pattern repeat, year after year, decade after decade. She would visit from Ottawa twice a year. Every visit ended the same way. Stuart would come upstairs after driving her to the bus station, and there would be a quietness in him I recognized. He'd stand at the kitchen window a moment before telling me how much he'd transferred to her account. I stopped asking why years ago. "It's Florence," he'd say, with the same tone people use to explain the weather. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that not a cent of it had ever been about Florence at all. Stuart's funeral was held on a Thursday, at the same church where we'd been married 38 years before. The turnout was larger than I expected. Colleagues from his firm, neighbors from our street, former students of mine who had heard through their parents. Florence sat 2 rows behind me, and we had not spoken since he died. Near the end of the service, I noticed a young man sitting alone near the back. Mid-30s, I guessed. He wore a dark suit that looked newer than the occasion warranted, like he'd bought it specifically for this. He had a careful stillness about him, not quite grief, but something heavier. When almost everyone had left and the minister was gathering his papers, the young man approached me. "Mrs. Alderton," he said. His hands were clasped in front of him like he was trying to keep them still. "My name is Declan. I knew your husband." "Were you a colleague of his?" He shook his head. "Not exactly." He hesitated. "He meant a great deal to me. I'm very sorry for your loss." Then he excused himself, and by the time I had turned back from a brief word with the minister, he was gone. I thought about him the entire drive home. Florence came to help me clear the house the following Saturday. We worked mostly in silence. She was good at the practical things: wrapping dishes, labeling boxes, carrying bags to the car. What she was not good at was looking at me directly. Around noon, I went looking for Stuart's old navy wool coat. He'd had it since the 90s and refused to part with it even when the elbows had gone shiny. I wanted to keep it. I don't know exactly why. Some things belong to a person so completely that discarding them feels like an additional loss. I found it in the hall closet, beneath a box of his engineering journals. When I pulled it down, something shifted in the pocket with a small, solid weight. I reached in and found an old Nokia phone. The flip kind with a physical keyboard, the kind no one had made in 15 years. The battery was dead, but I found an old charger in the junk drawer, and when I plugged it in, the screen flickered on. 43 text messages, all from a contact saved only as D. I read 3 before I had to sit down on the closet floor. The first was from 6 years ago. Stuart, the college accepted my application. Full scholarship. I wouldn't have been able to go back to school without you. I don't have the words. D. The second was from 4 years ago. Stuart, registered as a physiotherapist today. Official. I keep thinking about what you said at the hospital, that one winter doesn't have to ruin a whole life. You were right. D. The third was 8 months old, 4 months before Stuart died. Stuart, I've been thinking about Elspeth. Does she know any of this? She deserves to know. I think she deserves to know. D. Stuart had never replied to that one. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. Through the open hallway, I could see Florence wrapping Stuart's coffee mugs in newspaper. Her back to me, moving steadily, saying nothing. Over the next 3 days, I went through the cardboard boxes. Stuart had kept on the top shelf of his study closet. He had labeled them tax and financial, which had been enough to ensure I never looked inside them during 38 years of marriage. Stuart handled our money. He had a meticulous mind, and I trusted it completely. I thought I knew everything worth knowing about our finances. I did not know about the second checking account. It took most of an afternoon to count the transfers. They went back 19 years. Regular amounts, sometimes $700, sometimes $1,200, occasionally more, sent to an account in Florence's name, every few months. For 19 years. When I did the rough arithmetic, I had to set the papers face down on the desk and breathe. We had delayed the upstairs bathroom renovation for 6 years. We had taken exactly 3 international trips in close to 4 decades. I had always thought we were careful, sensible. I had believed Stuart when he said we should wait before spending on things we wanted. I called Florence the next morning and asked her to meet me at the coffee shop on James Street North, the one Stuart and I used to walk to on Sunday mornings. She arrived looking like she hadn't slept. I ordered for both of us and placed the bank statements on the table between us without saying a word. She looked at them. Her hands went still around her cup. "Florence," I said, "how long?" "Elspeth?" "Please don't." She closed her eyes. 19 years. "And you never said a word to me." "I made a promise to Stuart." The immediate confirmation, quiet, exhausted, without a single argument, hit differently than any denial could have. "How much of that money stayed with you?" She looked up. "None of it." "I don't believe you." "I know." Her voice was flat, not defensive. "I know you don't." "Then tell me where it went." She shook her head. "I can't. He asked me to keep it until he could tell you himself." "Stuart is dead." "I know that." Her voice cracked. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. "I know." I studied her across the table. She looked older than I had ever seen her. Not tired the way grief tires a person, but worn, the way guilt wears a person down over many years. I had spent decades reading Florence as someone who took and took without giving back. For the first time, sitting in that coffee shop, I wondered if I had been reading a story whose first chapter I had never actually seen. I left her there with half a cup of coffee and a question she wouldn't answer. That night, going through the coat one more time, I'm not sure what I was looking for, perhaps something that still held his particular warmth. I found an envelope folded into the inner breast pocket. My name was written on the front in Stuart's handwriting. Elspeth. Only that! The envelope had aged at the corners. This wasn't recent. Inside were 4 handwritten pages, except they were not 4 complete pages. They were 3.5. The final page ended in the middle of a sentence, the pen trailing off. He'd been interrupted, or he'd changed his mind, or someone had deliberately taken what came next. I read what remained twice slowly. My Elspeth. If you're reading this before I've found the courage to tell you myself, then something has gone wrong and I'm sorry, sorrier than this paper can hold. I've been writing this letter in my head for 19 years. I've started it on paper at least a dozen times. Each time I convince myself that next year I'll simply sit across from you at the kitchen table and say it out loud, the way I should have from the very beginning. Nothing I kept from you was ever about trusting you less. I trusted you with everything I was. It was my own shame I didn't trust to survive the telling. There is a young Man in Ottawa who deserves most of the credit for the person I became after January 2006. I have never introduced you because doing so would have required explaining what happened that night on Garner Road, and I have been afraid of how you would look at me afterward. I was the one driving. Florence was in the passenger seat. The roads were. And then the sentence ended. The next page was gone. I searched the entire envelope. Nothing. Someone had removed what followed, carefully, deliberately, and there was only one person it could have been. I drove to Florence's apartment the following morning without calling ahead. She opened the door in her housecoat, saw my face, and stepped back. I walked inside. On her kitchen table was a mug of tea and a paperback she wasn't reading. She sat down slowly, as if she'd been waiting for this. "You took the rest of the letter," I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Yes." "When?" "The day after he told me he'd written it. He asked me to hold on to the final pages until he was ready to give them to you himself." She looked at the wall. "He never asked for them back." "Why didn't you give them to me when he died?" "Because I'd promised." Her voice was even but fraying at the edges. "And because I thought. I don't know what I thought. I've been carrying this for 19 years, Elspeth. I didn't know what to do with it when the person who gave it to me was gone. Give them to me now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, walked to her bedroom, and came back with a plain white envelope. She set it on the table. "There's someone else you should probably speak to first," she said. "Stuart left instructions years ago with Rosalind Chung. He told me that if something happened before he told you himself, Rosalind could explain what I'm not able to. Rosalind Chung had prepared our wills and managed our estate paperwork, for 15 years. I had as our shared lawyer. I was beginning to understand she had been keeping Stuart's confidence for most of that time. She met me that same afternoon in her office on Main Street West. She was composed and measured the way good lawyers are. But when she looked at me, there was something else behind it. Relief, maybe, or the particular weariness of someone who has carried a confidence well past the point of comfort. "He left authorization for me to disclose if he became incapacitated, or if you came to me directly," she said. "I've been waiting to see which it would be." "Tell me about January 2006, I said. She nodded. Stuart was driving back from a site visit in Ancaster. Florence was with him. They'd had dinner. It was the 14th. Black ice on Garner Road. He lost control. The car struck a young man cycling on the shoulder. I felt the air go thin. "Was he?" "He survived. He was 18 years old. His name is Declan Reeves. He spent 11 weeks in hospital. His right leg was seriously affected. He required physiotherapy for over 2 years. Declan, the name from the phone, the young man at the funeral. Was Stuart charged? There was an investigation. The road conditions were ruled a significant contributing factor. The case was eventually closed without charges." She paused. "Legally, Stuart was cleared. He never accepted that for himself. So he decided to pay." "He decided to support," she said, gently but firmly. The difference mattered to him enormously. He didn't want Declan to feel like a settlement. He wanted him to have a future. She let that sit a moment. All of the transfers flowed through Florence's account because she had a connection to Declan's family through a mutual acquaintance from their neighborhood. She coordinated everything. She never kept a single dollar. Something I had believed for the better part of 2 decades began quietly to come apart. "Florence," I said. "She let me think all these years that she was taking from him. She knew what you thought. Stuart knew too. He believed telling you the truth would cause you more pain than allowing you to be frustrated with Florence. He was wrong. I told him so more than once." Rosalind's voice was careful but direct. It was his decision to make, and he made it badly. "What happened to the money in the end?" Declan stopped accepting support about 7 years ago. He had finished his training, established his practice, and told Stuart directly that he was all right. After that, by agreement between them, what remained was redirected into a small bursary at a physiotherapy college in Ottawa, for students who couldn't cover the program on their own. She folded her hands. "Florence contributes to it monthly. Neither of them ever mentioned it to anyone." I sat very still. Florence, the woman I had quietly filed away for decades as irresponsible, As someone who drained my husband without compunction, had been giving steadily, without recognition, without anyone to defend her, for years. I met Declan Reeves at a coffee shop in Ottawa 2 weeks later. He was already seated when I arrived, and stood when he saw me coming through the door. I recognized him from the church, the careful stillness, the suit that said he had prepared himself for this. He was 37 years old. He walked without a visible limp, but there was the faintest suggestion of effort in the way he carried his right side, the kind of thing you only notice when you're looking for it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You came to the funeral," I said. "You already knew who I was." "I've known who you were for a long time. Stuart talked about you." He said it simply, without any performance. "He talked about you a lot." We ordered coffee and sat across from each other the way strangers sit when they understand they are not, in fact, strangers at all. "Tell me what he was like," I said, "from your side." He was quiet for a moment. "The first time I saw him, I was in the hospital, 3 weeks in, 18 years old and furious at everyone, at him especially. He came one afternoon without calling ahead. He sat down and said, 'I'm not here to ask you to forgive me. I'm not sure that's fair to ask yet. I just want to know what you need.' He turned his cup in his hands. He came back the next week, and the week after that, when I went home, he called. When I went back to school and dropped out after a month because my leg wouldn't cooperate and everything felt impossible, he drove up and we sat in a Tim Hortons for 3 hours while I told him everything I was afraid of. He looked out at the canal. He never made me feel like a problem to be managed. He made me feel like someone he actually cared about." "When did you stop being angry at him?" "Somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd year." He smiled a little. "He never once asked me to stop. That helped." "Did you ever tell him he should tell me?" "Many times, especially in the last few years." He reached into his jacket and set a phone on the table. My own question reflected back at me from the saved messages. I kept telling him, "You deserve to know." He always said he was going to tell you soon. When he retired, when the time was right, he paused. "I think he was afraid of you seeing one January night instead of 38 years. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the Ottawa River was gray and wide and indifferent, and I thought about all the things you can carry alone when you are convinced that carrying them is kindness. I drove home from Ottawa with the radio off. Somewhere around Kingston, I pulled into a rest stop and sat watching the St. Lawrence for 20 minutes, letting myself feel all of it at once, the grief and the love, and the anger that was already changing shape into something I didn't have a word for yet. Stuart had not been hiding out of selfishness. He had been holding something the way certain people hold guilt, not because it made them feel better, but because they couldn't figure out how to set it down without hurting someone. He had been wrong not to tell me. That remained true, and I did not try to talk myself out of it. But so did everything else. Florence and I met again on a Sunday evening in April, at my kitchen table with tea I'd made carefully. I had read the rest of Stuart's letter by then, the pages Florence had kept. The ending was quieter than I expected. No unburdening, no drama, just Stuart's even, deliberate handwriting, explaining what had happened on Garner Road, and why he had responded the way he did, closing with a line I have returned to many times since. "I know I handled this wrong, but I refuse to believe I was wrong to try." Florence sat across from me and waited. "You should have told me," I said. "I know. He asked you not to, but you should have anyway." She looked up. "Maybe." She was quiet a moment, but I was the reason Stuart was on that road. I'd asked him to drive me home from dinner because I was tired. If I'd taken the bus, he'd have driven straight home from the site. She stopped. "I couldn't let him carry it alone, but I couldn't tell you without telling you all of it." I hadn't known that Florence had been carrying her own version of that January night for every bit, as long as Stuart had. "How much do you contribute?" I asked. "To the bursary." She looked down. "Whatever I can manage each month. It isn't much. Nothing close to what Stuart gave." "It isn't nothing, either." She said nothing. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She looked at it like she wasn't sure she'd understood correctly. "I owe you an apology," I said. "I spent a very long time deciding who you were." "You weren't entirely wrong," she said, her voice rough at the edges. "Who I used to be in my 20s into my 30s, I wasn't good to Stuart. I took advantage. I know that. She turned her hand over beneath mine. The accident changed me too, Elspeth. It wasn't only him. We sat there for a long time without saying much else. Outside, the April light was going soft and golden across the kitchen floor. Stuart's chair was still in its corner. Summer came slowly. I went back to Ottawa in June. Declan brought his wife, who was warm and quick and made me laugh twice without trying. He showed me a photograph on his phone, a small plaque installed at the physiotherapy college the previous fall. It read, "The Alderton Bursary, established in memory of Stuart Alderton, for students rebuilding their futures." Florence's name was there too, as co-founder, small and quiet beside his, just the way she'd been for 19 years. He never wanted any fuss, Declan said. He never did about anything, I said. Florence came for Christmas that December. She brought shortbread she'd baked herself and admitted freely that it had taken her 3 attempts. We laughed about that. She sat in Stuart's chair without asking, and I let her, and I realized it was the first time I hadn't felt the need to say anything about it. In January, the same month, 19 years on, I drove to the church where Stuart and I had married and sat in the pew where I had sat at his funeral, and I thought about what it means to love someone past the edge of your own understanding of them. I thought about Declan learning to walk again. I thought about Florence writing checks she never mentioned. I thought about Stuart sitting in a Tim Hortons with a furious 18-year-old, asking not for forgiveness, but only for the chance to help. I still think about that Tuesday morning. The kitchen door, his coat half-buttoned. The way he looked at me when I said I'm always fair, like he was storing it away somewhere he could find it when he needed it. I keep hoping he found it. I keep hoping he heard me mean it the second time, the time that counted, even though the second time I didn't know I was saying it at all.